The book isn't my accomplishment, and I'm sure Howard will say it's not his accomplishment. It was a joint project to which we happened to contribute, as did other people. My contribution was actually an interview. So it's a joint enterprise, first volume of several, on the thesis of the Cold War in the university. I'm not going to talk specifically about the book. I'll say a couple of words about the Cold War and where the universities fit into it, and maybe something about what happens now that the Cold War is technically over. There's a huge amount of historical scholarship on the Cold War, and I'm going to try to review it. There's also a standard picture, which I'll accept, of the course of that scholarship that sort of goes in the structure of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The thesis is the original position from the origins, sometimes called the orthodox or the traditional view, and that is that in a phrase, that the Cold War was the result of Soviet aggressiveness and intransigence, and the United States played a completely defensive and reactive role. It was simply a matter of light versus dark, absolute perfection versus total evil. If you want to read it in its purest form, if you haven't done it, you should read NSC 68, which everyone recognizes as the standard Cold War document, declassified, and no one ever quotes, if you look. And I think the reason it's never quoted is because the rhetoric is so outlandish, and the image it gives of the culture of the period is so intolerable that it's better to refer to it indirectly rather than to actually quote it. Well, that's the thesis. The antithesis is what's called revisionist scholarship that comes along in the mid-1960s as part of the whole ferment of that period, and that took the heretical position that the Cold War was a kind of interaction with both sides playing some role in initiating it and sustaining it. The synthesis, which is sometimes called post-revisionism, is basically the traditional Orthodox view with a few nuances. The leading figure, by common consent, is John Lewis Gaddis, sometimes called the Dean of Diplomatic Historians, the most authoritative studies and the leading figure in the field. I'll just refer to him. The revisionist heresy, when it came along, it caused enormous uproar and concern, which itself tells you something about the period. Arthur Schlesinger in October 1966 wrote that it's time to blow the whistle on the heresy. The date is kind of interesting because the heresy had barely been expressed at that time. In fact, he was responding to a review by a young historian of a book about the Cold War, in which the historian said, Gar Alperovitz it was, said that the Cold War cannot be seen simply as an American response to Soviet challenges, but rather has to be traced to a mutual interaction of insidious suspicions for which blame must be shared by all. Okay, that was the heresy, and this Schlesinger was so outraged, he once wrote that it's time to blow the whistle on this before things really get out of hand and the plague spreads. A couple of years later, Henry Kissinger lamented that in the 1960s, European intellectuals began to argue that the Cold War was caused by American as well as Soviet policy, and a verbal and sometimes violent minority in the United States challenged the hitherto almost unanimous conviction that the Cold War had been caused by Soviet intransigence alone. In other words, the pillars were really collapsing. He was writing at a time of great concern about what was called the crisis of democracy. It was the title of an important book, which, again, everyone ought to read. First and only serious study by the Trilateral Commission in the mid-'70s. They were concerned by the fact that during the 60s in all the trilateral areas, Europe, Japan, and the United States, there had been sectors of the population that are normally quiescent and obedient, had become organized and had tried to enter the political arena to press their demands, which created a crisis of democracy, which has to be overcome by driving them back to apathy and obedience and out of the political arena where they have no place to be. One aspect of this crisis of democracy, incidentally, this was from the liberal end of the spectrum, these comments. These are the groups around the Carter administration. In fact, the whole Carter administration was drawn from this. One of the problems was that the media were becoming much too adversarial, and they said it might be necessary to think about means to try to control the media because they're really also getting out of hand. And another problem had to do with what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That meant the universities, the schools, the churches, and so on. They weren't doing their job of indoctrinating the young properly, and something would have to be done about that. And the spread of this awful heresy, saying that maybe it wasn't just pure light versus pure darkness, was one aspect of that. The post-war synthesis was just, the post-revisionist synthesis was just kind of coming into appearing at that point to try to, end this heresy. And its own framework and point of view is kind of interesting. As I said, the main figure is John Lewis Gaddis. He writes, and I basically agree with what he says, so I'll just quote him. He says that he traces the origins of the Cold War to 1917, which I think is correct. Another phase began in 1945. As you know, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, within a couple of months, there was an invasion of Russia by the West, in which the United States participated. Incidentally, it was taken pretty seriously. This has yet, the documents on what I'm just going to now say have been out for about 15 years, but they have yet to enter the public record as far as I know. The British took the thing so seriously that they used poison gas on the Northern Front. And remember, this was right after World War I. That was the ultimate atrocity at the time. But they weren't kidding around. The Western intervention, Gaddis describes it, and he says it was justified, and in fact it was defensive. It was, I'll quote, "It was in response to a profound and potentially far-reaching intervention by the new Soviet government in the internal affairs, not just of the West, but of virtually every country in the world, namely the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist order." So the security of the United States was already in danger in 1917, not just 1950, and the invasion of Russia was entirely warranted in defense. Well, in defense against what? In defense against an internal change in Russia, an announcement of revolutionary intentions. That justifies invasion in defense because it's a threat to us. Notice, by the same logic, if, say, the United States calls for global capitalism or something, any country in the world that feels that they want to take some different course is entirely justified in carrying out a defensive invasion of the United States. And if they don't have the power for that, at least carrying out international terrorism, which is like, say, blowing up the World Trade Center, which is several steps short of aggression. But the point is, he has captured the mentality exactly by leaving the Western orbit and announcing that they wanted others to do so too. That was an intolerable challenge, and it does justify aggression in order to block it. That is, as I'm sure you know, the standard justification that's given all the time for intervention in the Third World. And remember, Russia was the original Third World. That goes back to the 15th century, when I think that's crucial to bear in mind when you think about the Cold War. Back around the 15th century, Europe began to divide, with the West beginning to develop and the eastern half becoming sort of its service area. Raw materials, markets, cheap labor, that kind of thing. And that division continued. Actually, there's a fault line right down Germany. The division continued right into early this century. The East became relatively more impoverished, that is, relative to the West, right until early in this century. And then in 1917, Russia adopted a course, I'll quote, that reduced its willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West, which is the major threat of communism. Actually, I'm quoting from a very important 1955 study by a prestigious study group of the political economy of U.S. foreign policy, and I think they hit it right on the nose. That was the threat of communism, the refusal to complement the industrial economies of the West, which is the job of the Third World. It was still worse than that. Russia was what later came to be called a virus that was spreading the infection to others. That's what Gaddis is talking about. They were calling on others to follow that same unacceptable course right into the 1960s, when our record runs dry. That's where the record of declassified documents ends. Right into the 1960s, the major concern of U.S. and British planners was precisely that, Soviet success. They were going to be a model that others might follow. So, for example, Arthur Schlesinger, in a memo to, very recently declassified memo to John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, talking about Cuba, says that the problem is the spread of the Castro idea of taking taking things into your own hands and demanding the opportunity for a decent living. All of this stimulated by the Soviet Union, which is presenting itself as a model for modernization in one generation. So not only did they refuse to complement the industrial economies of the West, violating the rules for the Third World, but they're even inducing others to do so. Incidentally, by this time, the United States had also already, in secret, formally determined that it would overthrow the government of Cuba. This is the basic logic of the North-South conflict. And I think if you look at the Cold War, it applies very well. Of course, the scale was so different in this case that it took on a life of its own. But the logic is not dissimilar from the threat posed by Grenada and Nicaragua and Cuba and lots of others. And it's not very surprising, I think, that after 1989, the region is returning to what it was, pretty much. So the parts that were part of the West, like, say, Czech Republic, at least, and Western Poland, they're returning to the West. They're becoming what they were, part of the industrial societies. The others are sinking into deep third world misery with all the standard third world properties. Here, it's all attributed to the failures of communism. It's a little hard to explain why it happened after 1989, and also why it so totally resembles everything that's gone on in the places that have continued to play their role of being complementary to the industrial economies of the West, not precisely by choice. So in brief, I think Gaddis is basically right. He's right in the post-revisionist consensus, right in dating the Cold War, and also in identifying the challenge. The challenge was success and the threat that it might be a model to others. I think one interesting result of contemporary scholarship is it's now overwhelmingly obvious, and really not denied on any side, that the threat was pretty much what George Kennan said in secret in 1947, not a military challenge, but a political challenge, namely this political challenge. The unwillingness to accept the role of being complementary to the West, and even instigating others to follow this idea of trying to get a decent life and doing it your own way, the virus effect. And that goes right up to the present. I can give you examples from right now, but time's short, so I won't proceed. Anyhow, in my view, that's the essence of the Cold War, and I think you see, and the attitudes that it engenders, and I think you see it right in the orthodox scholarship. I don't think you have to go to critical scholarship to see this. It comes right out in the mainstream. So, for example, in the fact that, say, Gaddis's view, which I described, doesn't seem strange to anyone. See, yeah, that's right. I mean, we have a right to invade another country if it carries out an internal change and says that others should do so likewise, particularly if it seems to be succeeding and maybe offering a model that others might want to follow. That's a challenge, and obviously we have a right to use violence in self-defense. You might search for a critique of that view. Well, where do the universities figure in all this? Two major respects. First of all, they have to forge the kind of doctrinal framework, make sure they are, after all, the institutions responsible for indoctrinating the young. and they got to make sure that the young are properly indoctrinated, and in fact, that the old are indoctrinated too. The people who do the indoctrinating have to believe it, and other people who, reach a general audience in the through the major mechanisms. You're allowed to have hawks and doves, so that's fair. That's not only allowed but required. There should be very lively debate. That's very useful for a propaganda system, but it should be within an extremely narrow framework. So the debate should be, as it was, for example, over Nicaragua, biggest issue of the 80s. Actually, I've reviewed a lot of the record on this. The hawks say we should overthrow the government by violence. The doves say, no, that's going to be too costly for us. We should overthrow it in other ways and restore it to what was called the Central American mode, imposing regional standards, that is, the standards of El Salvador and Guatemala. I'm quoting Tom Wicker and other doves. And between those extreme views, you should have a terrific controversy. But the idea that there might be something outside that framework should be unthinkable. Quite apart from the doctrinal side, the universities have played a very significant role within the domestic economy. That's discussed in a number of those papers. I lost track of time. Am I going on too long?
I'm not keeping track of time.
I'm supposed to talk briefly.
Don't worry about it.
A couple more minutes. Okay. Sorry, I should have looked at my watch, but I forgot. There's an extremely important and role that the universities have played within the entire domestic economy. In brief, I'm sure you must, if you don't know this, you really should. It's very important. During the 30s, there was, of course, a huge depression. The New Deal didn't do much with it. The war got us out of it. The war was extremely successful from the U.S. point of view. U.S. industrial, the U.S. had a kind of a command economy. Industrial production tripled. The country was producing like mad. There was a lesson that was taught later. It was called the lesson of Keynes, namely that if the government mobilizes resources and pours them into the economy, they can stimulate production and maintain a sort of state capitalist economy. Furthermore, that lesson was taught to exactly the guys who had to learn it, namely the corporate managers who were brought to Washington to run the semi-command economy that succeeded in this. They got the message, and they carried it into the post-war period. It was assumed across the board, economists, industrialists, everyone else, that if the spigot was turned off, the country would go right back to the Depression. And if you read the business, this isn't even secret, it's all in the business press in the late 40s. In the business press in the late 40s, Fortune, Business Week, and so on, there was a lot of talk about how advanced industry cannot survive in a competitive, unsubsidized, free enterprise economy, and the government must be the savior. There was also discussion about how that should be done, and for rather sensible reasons, it was decided that the military was the best way to do it. One of the reasons, it was recognized that social spending would work, that everybody knew, this sort of Keynesian stories you learn in first-year economics about hiding dollars in the sand and so on, that they understood. They knew that social spending could have the same stimulative effect, but it has a downside. Social spending has a redistributive effect, and it has a democratizing effect, like people care where there's going to be a hospital. They don't have any opinions on what kind of missile you should build. And furthermore, social spending is not a direct subsidy to the corporate sector. It's kind of indirect. Military spending has none of these problems. It's redistributive, but upward. It's anti-democratic, keeps people out of policy, and it's a direct gift to corporations. So besides, it's easy to sell. And that was put very frankly. So Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, advised that the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. And that's exactly the story from then till today. You use the word security when you mean subsidy. Then people hide, and the Cold War was very helpful. It existed, but it was stimulated. It both contributed to this and was stimulated by it. And in fact, without proceeding, just about you'll take a look at any dynamic sector of the economy since then and right up till today, and you'll find it's very heavily dependent on this system of the public is assuming the costs and also assuming the risks, incidentally, if anything goes wrong. but the profit being privatized. That's the existing system. It comes straight out of the early Cold War period, and it interacts closely with the Cold War, and the universities play a crucial role here. First of all, they're like, say, where IT, why do I have a job? Very simple. Because MIT is part of the funnel by which public funds get poured into high-tech industry, and it gives them a little luxury to have fringes around the edge, like a music department or, me or something. But that's, basically what a good part of the universities are about, as well as creating the doctrinal framework for all of this, which means not only instilling Cold War ideology, but preventing people from knowing things like that. So try to find a department of the university that studies the way the American economy works, namely this way. It's not in the economics department because they're doing, models of economies in 10-dimensional space or something. It's not in the political science department because they're studying electoral policies and so on and so forth. If there's a business school, it's probably taught in the business school. But that's about, and it's certainly not in the general curriculum, but these are the core issues of the American economy. So you read the newspapers today, front pages all full of, say, the great decision at the World Trade Organization to, let the U.S. Telecommunications industry take over the world, which is what it amounts to. And this is supposed to show our passion for free markets and the terrific American way and the way we're exporting our values. I mean, I'm quoting. How did the telecommunications industry in the United States get to the point where it can take over the world? I mean, like they put up the satellites and created the computers and the networking and the ARPANET and the software and the fiber optics cables and so on? Absolutely not. This is public resources funneled in large measure through the universities, done a lot of the direct organization by DARPA, the Pentagon Research Agency, which sort of started up the startup companies and initiated most of the new ideas. When it finally works, you hand it over to private corporations, and then our passion for free markets, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the part of a good indoctrination system is not letting people see what is so obvious, I mean, it's right in front of everyone's eyes, but you're not supposed to see it, and if the system really is working, like if the institutions for indoctrination of the young and everyone else are functioning properly, so there's no crisis of democracy, then yeah, you can write about the passion for free markets and all the rest of it. Well, all of this raises a number of questions, and they're not trivial. One question is whether public funds, how should they be used? How should public resources be used to lay the basis for the economy and the intellectual culture of the future, say? That's one question. Not trivial, I don't think. A second is, should the results of whatever comes out of public funds be handed over just automatically to unaccountable private power? Third question, who should make the decisions about this? Should it be a topic of public discussion and debate? And should the public be involved in deciding on these non-trivial questions? Well, there's very little. About the third question, there shouldn't be any debate, at least among people who think that democracy might be an amusing idea. But the idea, in practice, it just doesn't happen. It's not even an option. So, for example, the whole business about telecommunications, including the 1966 Telecommunications Act and this latest thing, it's not even treated as a public interest story. It's a business story. How should the system be handed over to private power? Not should it be handed over to private power. That's not even at issue. Just what modality should be used to take this huge public giveaway and hand it over to private power. And notice there's a little more than just giving the aircraft industry away, because this whole system is crucial for the functioning of a democratic system, but virtually no discussion. The public is not supposed to be involved in this. That's true in practice, not just in this case, but in the whole background, and it's even a principle. It's a principle you can read about in standard texts on American politics. For example, one that's written by, a couple of years ago, by a guy with the lovely title of Professor of Science of Government at Harvard, who explained that the architects of power must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to sunlight, it begins to evaporate. I think that statement is very accurate, just like the statements by other leading intellectuals and academics who I quoted earlier, and part of the task of the institutions that are responsible for the indoctrination of the young and everyone else is to protect power from exposure. The Cold War provided a framework for that, but the issue is far broader, and it remains with us long after the Berlin Wall has thankfully collapsed into ruins.
You think it's easy to follow Noam Chomsky? He asked me as we were sitting here, when is the last time we were on a platform together? And I think it was the last teach-in of the Vietnam War. And I mean, we've been on a lot of platforms separately since, but nobody's ever dared to put us together. And, I say it was the last teach-in of the Vietnam War. It happened at Brandeis, and we were having a teach-in to protest against American military aid to the Saigon government. It was the end of April 1975, and as we were sitting on a platform, a Brandeis student came running down the aisle holding a news dispatch in his hand, and said, "The Saigon government has surrendered, the war in Vietnam is over." The place exploded. That was the last teach-in of the war. So I'm hoping that sometime in the course of the evening, somebody will come and give us some real good news. You know, like every government in the world has been overthrown. Anyway, I think it's useful to expand the definition of sort of the Cold War from the traditional one, as Noam was talking about. And the traditional one has it starting at the end of World War II, and the United States confronting the Soviet Union, and then follows a whole series of interventions by, the Soviet Union takes over Eastern Europe, the United States intervenes in a lot of other places in the world, and it all ends happily in 1989, when, as everybody knows, the Cold War is over, capitalism has triumphed, and everybody's happy. I walk around looking for signs of happiness now that it's over. But you look at the characteristics of that Cold War, the characteristics of the United States being a military apparatus, military intervention, repression at home. Well, you find that these characteristics exist before 1945. Well, as Noam was saying, you can extend the Cold War back to 1917 to the American military intervention in Siberia to try to overthrow the new Bolshevik government. But if you look before 1917, before there was a Soviet Union, right, and you find the United States intervening again and again and again, right? The United States intervening in Cuba, the United States taking over the Philippines, taking over Hawaii, intervening in Panama. The Marines are going into the Dominican Republic, they're going into Haiti, and all this before 1917, before there's a communist threat. And at the same time, we're having repression at home, and before there's a Bolshevik revolution, the people who are speaking out against World War I in the United States are arrested and put in jail. All this before there's a Soviet Union. It suggests that there isn't that clear-cut sort of beginning of that Cold War period and a clear-cut ending. Well, certainly, does 1989 end American military intervention in other parts of the world? Now that there's no Soviet threat, no more military intervention, well, we soon have several more, And, of course, we have the Gulf War. No Soviet threat, but you can always find a good reason for having a war. You don't need the Soviet Union. It just helped a lot to have the Soviet Union around during that period. It helped a lot for intervention. You could call anything a Soviet threat, right? Somebody is elected democratically in Guatemala in 1954. Democratically elected, that's what we say we want. No, not then, no. Not if you pick the wrong guy. Not if the people have elected somebody who takes over the land of united fruit. Well, we can't have that. United fruit is us. And so we overthrow the government of Guatemala. It's not a communist threat. Iran, 1953, overthrow the government of Iran, no communist threat. Of course, there's oil. You don't need a communist threat if you have oil, they say. So, 1989, capitalism wins. Everything is fine. Is everything fine? Democracy has come to all the formerly Soviet East Bloc countries. Really? Oh, they've had elections in the Soviet Union? They have a two-party state? 3, 4, 5, 6? At the same time that we become a one-party state? And here in the United States, can we talk about the triumph of capitalism in the United States? How wonderful it is now that we defeated the Soviet Union, and we know we don't have to worry about them anymore. Everything is fine here. The Dow Jones average is way up. That's terrific. The Dow Jones average tells us exactly how Americans are faring. It must be the measure of the economic prosperity of all Americans, because it's there on the news every night. You can't miss it. If the Dow Jones average has gone up, we're obviously all doing better, you see. You can try it out. Next time you're in a restaurant, just say to the waitress, "Did you know that the Dow Jones average has gone up 30 points?" She'll be very happy to hear that. Why don't they put on TV how many people are looking for work? Why don't they put on TV statistics about how many kids died yesterday before the age of 1 because they were sick, because they couldn't get medical care, because they didn't have enough to eat? There are all sorts of figures and statistics they could put on television beside the Dow Jones average to give us a picture of what really is happening in this country. I'm suggesting that we need to extend this whole question of the Cold War from that period in which the Soviet Union became partly the reason and partly the excuse, for what the United States was doing before the Soviet Union arrived on the scene and what the United States has been doing since the Soviet Union left the scene. And that is, there's a larger and long continuum of struggle for peace and justice in the world, struggle for change in the world, struggle to overthrow governments in the world, struggle to change the system here. And that went on before, and that's continuing to go on now. And the universities, well, they can't escape it. I mean, when you first enter universities, you think you're going to escape it. You think, the university, it'll be nice there. It's not like the rest of the world, but it is. It's just like the rest of the world. Money, power, commerce, greed, competition. Well, it's part of the rest of the world. And who controls the universities? Very often they're the same people who control the business corporations, right? And how much democracy is there in the university? Universities are not democratic. I mean, some universities even pride themselves in not being democratic. Some university presidents say, no. I didn't mean to say that. Really. But universities are supposed to, yes, they're part of the system, and as Noam said, they have jobs. Their job is to indoctrinate. Their job is to keep control. Their job is to turn people out, who will take their obedient places in society to do the jobs that need to be done in society and not to make any trouble. Really. The problem is that universities are also something else, and that is they're places where people read. And there are libraries. and people have a little more time to think, and there are a lot of young people in universities, and there's a certain idealism in young people, before they've been captured by the real world. I mean, they've escaped from their parents, they've not yet been captured by the business world, have a few moments to think, you see. So there are great possibilities there, possibilities for trouble. In 1950, I was going to say, I remember in 1950. No, I don't remember anything about 1950. But in 1950, a congressman from Illinois, Harold Velde of Illinois, he was a former FBI man, perfect congressman, of course, and soon to be a member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And Velde got up in Congress and spoke out against a bill. The bill was to appropriate money for mobile libraries to go through the rural areas so that people in rural areas would have books to read. And Velde spoke up against it, saying, education is the first step towards communism. Well, I mean, he was not quite right, of course, because mostly education is not. But it has all sorts of dangerous possibilities, and at certain points in history, those possibilities become real. I was teaching in the South, from 1956 to 1963. I was teaching at a black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia, and I could see when I got there in the 50s, I could see my students acting out the role that college students in colleges and universities were supposed to play. That is, these young black women were there to learn well and to take their place in the segregated society of the United States, to become the social workers and teachers and maybe an occasional doctor and lawyer, but yeah, to take their, and they were trained that way, and they were supposed to be obedient, and they were regulated and controlled that way. But then something happened, and as everybody knows. And then suddenly everything changed. And some people stepped out first, and then other people stepped out, and soon that wall that was around our campus had been taken down, and the students were out in the street and out demonstrating and out getting arrested, and learning. Very important. And their education was beginning in a real way. I remember a colleague of mine saying, "This is bad. Our students are cutting my classes. They're ruining their education." Well, I mean, what happened in the 60s is the students who went out the black students who went out in the civil rights movement, and then in the anti-war movement, the students who got involved in the anti-war movement, they were giving themselves a marvelous education. They were learning so much about the world. And if and when they went back to the classroom, they went back with a much, much greater curiosity about the world, a much, much wider understanding of what they should look for and what books to look for and what ideas to look for, and a much more critical understanding of what was missing in the education that they had gotten up to that point. I saw that in my students who went out, and when they came back from jail, they were looking for Du Bois, and they were looking for black history, and they were looking for things that didn't exist in their education before. And what happened in those movements, this is the dangerous thing about education, so, students who step outside the classroom become dangerous. Students who confront the real world, students who learn about governance, students who learn about the police, students who learn that the things that were taught to them in junior high school about how the government works, oh, this is democracy. We have 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial. We have checks and balances. Great. Yeah. And then they walk out in one demonstration on one peaceful picket line, and the world comes crashing down on them. Yes, education. This is what they have against the 60s. You notice they have something against the 60s? You see, all sorts of things happen. Education changed. People began to think in a different way, in a more critical way, and the curriculum began to change. Well, we know that black studies and feminist studies and even gay studies, and as a result, there's a lot of hysteria around now. among, the people up there, out there. I don't know where they are exactly, but their emanations come to us from time to time, and they're wild. It started with I don't know if it started with Alan Bloom, but he became, the closing of the American mind. The 60s had closed the American mind. I don't know, it closed his mind, you see. It closed his mind to what was going on. But they were upset that he was upset students were leaving his seminar on Plato and going out into the street to demonstrate. You see, this is intolerable. Well, this is what was happening. And so all this, multicultural education, a terrible thought. Feminist study is a terrible thought. But what it means is that, yes, the movements had an effect on the universities, had an effect on the curriculum, it had an effect on the ideas of young people, and they didn't like that. They've been working to suppress that and working to change that and working to regain control, really. That's what's been happening. When they talk about doing away with the Vietnam Syndrome, they're trying to do away with the things that people learned in the 60s about war, about government, about education. The hope is that they won't succeed. That the history of those years will not be lost, that the exhilaration of those movements will not be forgotten, that education will begin to have the kind of meaning that education always has when people are engaged in social struggle for justice. And so there are things for university students to do, and college students and community college students and other people to do these days. Obviously, since the Cold War, in the larger sense, is not over, that is, the struggle is not over, the $250 billion military budget, and the no money for this, and no money for that, no money for health, and no money for women, and no money for children, and no money for this. There's just money for the military budget, and as for these other people, if too many of them are going to be in trouble and desperate and hanging around the streets and committing crime and taking drugs, well, we'll just build more jails for them, and that will take care. That's the situation we're facing, and it's a situation which calls for a new social movement in this country. Absolutely. And a situation in which we need, there you have 12 people who are ready to join it. You see. But it's a good beginning, you say. Yes, and the hope is that university students can play a role in this. And things are happening all the time in which people can take part. Somebody's happening this Saturday with the homeless in Boston. Some group right in Boston meeting at Copley Square. There's a group that's organized for people to occupy, people who need homes to occupy the thousands and thousands of vacant places that exist that are owned by the city that are not being used while there are homeless people on the streets. There's all sorts of things going on, all sorts of cultural things going on. They're showing the movie Attica, all sorts of things that are happening out there which we can all be a part of. And so I hope we will. Thank you.
Howard just asked me to add a footnote to his final comments, and that is, as we were walking in, we got an announcement that Detroit, I didn't have a chance to read it yet, so I'll just read it off. The Detroit newspaper strikers are in town, or will be, and there's going to be an event 4 o'clock on Thursday. Well, that's a talk, but at 9 a.m. Saturday, February 22nd, there's going to be a rally at Sullivan, local 25 parking lot near Sullivan Square, and it's going to be a caravan going to the Gannett plant in Norwood. This is part of a protest in support of the Detroit newspaper strikers who've been out for a long time. That's now amounts to a lockout. You can hear more about it there.
Yeah, there's a question period.
Thanks for that announcement, Noam. In the light of that, I was amazed to see strikers, union members from the Detroit newspapers earlier today who informed us that this strike was continuing because I had read in the New York Times, and of course it's the absolute truth in a very pro-labor newspaper, that the strike was over, and I had gotten a definite impression that the strike was over. Well, it is not over, and I encourage people to find out from the workers from Detroit, if possible, just exactly what's going on. I'd also like to ask people to take an interest in the case of a young American woman who was a student at MIT just a few years ago, who's 28 years old and who has been in prison for over a year now, sentenced to life in prison by a secret military tribunal in Peru, accused of a variety of different things depending on what time the government was making the accusations. Basically had no opportunity to defend herself, and again has been described in the New York Times as having admitted to being a member of the MRTA. This is not true. In fact, there was a recent statement from the official MRTA representative in Europe, for what that's worth, that she was in no way a member and did in no way know anything about this whole thing. And her name is Lori Berenson, and you can write her in prison. Do what you can to help. You can find out more about it if you have access to the World Wide Web. There is a page with a lot of very good information about her. My question to you would be, there are so many different issues, and I hope other people will make announcements and bring forward other concerns. But I guess, does either of you have any insight, any thought about how this very disparate and energetic, fragmented series of organizations and movements might come together to be a more unified force in this society?
Could we encourage you to use the mic on the podium, since most of the alternative media is hooked up there?
You can always tell who wins. No, you take the tough questions. I don't know. Well, sure, that's our big, that's a big problem. We have lots of things going on in the country. People in one part of the country don't know what's happening in another part of the country. There's an amazing number of actions that take place all over this country. If you travel around the country, Noam does, and he knows about these. If you travel around the country, it's amazing what is going on. I mean, you're in Duluth, Minnesota, and you're at a meeting of 300 people, and there are 16 tables in the back of the room with 16 different organizations in Duluth. I'm not trying to put down Duluth, but you don't expect it, you see, but it's everywhere. And so the problem, how is these going to be brought together? I said, yes, I don't know, except that I think it will take a kind of a concentration on some central issue. As and during the Civil Rights Movement, we had the central issue of racial segregation that created a national movement, and during Vietnam, we had that as a unifying issue, which brought all sorts of organizations together. And it just seems to me, if there's any issue that can bring all the different groups together, it's the issue of the rational and just distribution of the enormous wealth of the United States, you see. And that, because it affects everybody. It affects the women's groups and the environmental groups and the anti-war groups. It affects everybody because everybody, the problems cannot be solved without using the resources that we have, and they're available.
Well, I'm not addressing my question to any particular person. Anyone who wants to take it. As we know, the capitalist classes are telling us that this is the end of history. Capitalism has won the global economy is upon us and can't be turned back. We just have to live by whatever the dictates of the market are. But I don't really believe that, and I know I don't think you believe that either. I was wondering if either of you have thought about how the next phase of struggles will develop. Will there be rebellions in various countries against the New World Order? Will there be increasing resentment here in the United States because we're asked to play such a large role in assuring capitalist dominance in the New World Order? How do you conceive a resistance developing? Okay.
Well, first thing to bear in mind is that this talk about the end of history and the victory and, the utopia of the masters and so on, we've been hearing that for 170 years. I won't run through the whole history, but this is periodic affair. It looks as if as if opposition's been smashed, the labor movement's been destroyed, people are back in their holes, and so on and so forth, and then a few years later, everything blows up. So without going back to the 1830s when it begins, just take, say, the 1920s. What Howard was talking about a bit, after the Red Scare. The country's leading labor leader, also presidential candidate, was in jail, put there by Woodrow Wilson because he questioned the nobility of Wilson's war. The labor movement was destroyed. And by violence. This was no joke. The United States has a very violent labor history. This is the period of the big mass production of automobiles and so on. Labor just had nothing to do with it. They were virtually wiped out. People were afraid to have meetings in big formerly union towns, working class towns. It was too frightening. There was a lot of euphoria about how everything was wonderful, end of history, terrific, and so on. A couple of years later, the country was in total turmoil. Workers taking over plants, forcing through legislation that brought the United States more or less into the mainstream of industrial society, what we call the New Deal measures. That caused huge hysteria on the part of the masters. They were very, very worried about it. Huge campaigns started right in the late 30s to try to beat everybody back into their shells. During the Second World War, was kind of put on hold, started off right away afterwards. By the 1950s, it was again a period of celebration of apathy and quiescence and the end of ideology, and everything's fine. Now it's just a little tinkering around the edges. A couple of years later, Howard students are out on the streets, everybody else is out on the streets, the whole country is blowing up, and we have a crisis of democracy. Well, since then, since the early 70s, there's been another major effort to try to restore apathy and obedience and so on. And what will happen next? If anybody, nobody's ever succeeded in predicting in the past. You take a look at the record. You can't predict tomorrow's weather, To try to predict what will happen in human affairs is completely out of the question. I mean, these aren't things that you sit around making predictions about. They're things you try to do something about. And there's plenty of opportunity. It's striking. I travel like Howard does, not only here, but also around the world, and it's very different. It's interesting to hear where you hear questions about what we should do, mostly in privileged sectors. So, for example, including in the United States, I just came back from a couple of weeks ago from Brazil. Brazil's it's ranked next to Albania in the UN Development Report. It should be an extremely rich country. It's had the benefit of our tutelage for 50 years. Certainly should have helped it. Brazil has the biggest radical democratic party in the world, labor-based party run by a steel worker peasant from the Northeast. They'd easily win any election if you could possibly have a fair election. I mean, they get smashed by the 100% of the media at the last minute, but otherwise they'd have won the last two presidential elections. It's a kind of an umbrella group, which includes all sorts of social movements. I happened to spend some time meeting with them, including Lula leadership. Independently of that, there's 150,000 or so families in a landless workers movement, completely separate, just taking over land. You know, a lot of struggle, like a lot of them get killed, and it's going on right now all the time. Independently of all that, there's a big network of rural trade unions for rural proletariat. A lot of the land is unused. People want it. They want to organize for it. There's indigenous movements. There's big popular media projects. I mean, here everybody complains about how we can't get onto the media. There, I spent an evening at a popular media project out in the, Brazil's like Europe, the opposite of the United States in the way cities are organized. The downtown is the rich place and the suburbs are the poor place. By and large. So out in the suburbs, a place with a couple of million people living in something ranging from suffering to misery, there are public television in the squares, helped a little by an NGO, a couple of professionals from the town, but all they do is provide the equipment. They come out with a truck and a big screen and set it up in a public square, and a couple hundred people gather, and they see things that are done by the people in the community. They see it's written by them, directed by them, acted by them. The actors, when I was there, the main actress was a kid, looked about 17, was walking around in the crowd interviewing people about people who were sitting at a bar, standing and talking to their kids or something, about the programs that they were seeing. Their comments were broadcast on the screen. People were talking about that. Big project, and on and on. These are people with no resources, I mean, very, very poor people, and projects coming all over the place. I mean, for us to talk about the inability to deal with things is sort of, it's something really wrong about it. I mean, we should not ask that kind of question. There are so many opportunities with the resources we have, and when you see people with no resources, it's pretty striking. And that's the same is true in the United States. And I think we should take a lesson from that. As far as the globalization and the triumph of the free market is concerned and all that business, I mean, I won't repeat, but as far as the free market is concerned, probably the last time there was anything remotely like a free market was the Asian trading area before the merchant adventurers broke into it about 500 years ago. It was vaguely like a free market. Ever since then, there's been a kind of a double-edged free market. Free markets are great for you, but I need the protection of a powerful state. And that's exactly the way it is now. What I said about telecommunications is absolutely standard. It's true of every part of the economy. I mean, the leading welfare freak in the country happens to be Newt Gingrich, who brings more public subsidies to his district than any comparable district in the country. The most protectionist government in post-war history was the Reagan administration. Probably double protectionism, saved, plus pouring tons of money into industry. That's what saved, the steel industry, the automotive industry, the semiconductor industry, and so on. Just a couple of weeks ago, Japan announced that they were going to set up a big program to rebuild the semiconductor industry in Japan to try to compensate for the advantages that the U.S. industry had gotten through Reaganite protectionism and public funding. Same day, this is all on the business pages, it's not on the front page. Same day, the business pages reported that the United States, the Clinton administration had decided that the next, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of jet planes would not go to McDonnell Douglas, which builds jet planes, but to Boeing, which produces commercial aircraft because they need the shot in the arm from the publicly produced technology, which then they can convert to commercial uses. That's what's called capitalism. If you look at there is a good technical study of the top 100 transnational corporations. It just came out about a year ago in England on the Fortune list. They found that all 100 of them had benefited from the industrial policies of their home countries, and 20 were saved from total destruction, either by public takeover or bailout when they got into trouble. That's free market capitalism, right across the board. It's fine for 7-year-old kids, but not for rich people. They need protection, and they get plenty of it in all these ways. That's part of what the university is about. As far as globalization is concerned, it's real, and you can argue about whether it's good or bad, but it's not, the scale is nothing particularly novel. In fact, as a number of people have pointed out, by gross measures like trade and investment flows and that sort of thing, it's about back to what it was around 1913. I mean, there are some differences. You know, they're striking, mostly in financial capital, the speed with which speculative capital moves around, which incidentally is a reflection of state policy, you know, in many ways, including the telecommunications that makes it possible. So that's an outgrowth of the state sector of the economy. But you know, there's nothing, and in fact, of the interchanges globally, about 3/4 of them are within Europe, Japan, and the United States. That is 3 regions where there are at least formally democratic policies in place. That is, you can make policy without fear of military coups, at least, which is not a small thing, meaning the public has formal mechanisms to determine how this works. If the mechanisms aren't used, well, okay, that is something you try to do something about. But the idea that it's either free market capitalism or out of control, you know, or something totally new, or the end of history, I mean, this is not a word of this, I don't think, can be sustained. As far as predictions, it seems to me pointless to worry about them. Nobody's ever been predicting correctly in the past. We won't predict properly now. The thing is to do something about it.
I'm a member of an organization called the Spartacus League, which is a revolutionary socialist organization. And I think it's pretty safe to say that if you take a look at society and history, that all of the problems of society, whether it be imperialist war, the increasing racist attacks on blacks and immigrants, excuse me, attacks on women and so forth, things like that, all are derived from the same thing, which is the capitalist system that which we live in. That is a system where production is for private profit as opposed to social use. And what I and what the organization that I represent think is that what has to happen in order to be able to, provide, for example, homes for the homeless, or to fight back against the attacks on abortion rights, or all these questions all across the board, is basically the same thing. And we think that the working class, which the multiracial integrated working class, which are the people who have their hands on the direct means of production, the factories, the railroads, so forth, that they have to basically lead a revolution in this country, and across the world for that matter, that is going to take power out of the hands of the capitalist class, and that's going to introduce a socialist system in which production will be used, so that we don't have all these, what the word I'm looking for, contradictions that that have been discussed tonight. Thousands of dollars being spent on missiles when you can take a walk around Harvard Square and see all the homeless people, for example. And what we think is really necessary for the forging of that revolution is going to be a multiracial party based on what's the word I'm looking for again? Multiracial party that acts, as Lenin said, as a tribune of all the oppressed. That is, that focuses the fight against black oppression, against women's oppression, oppression against homosexuals, and so forth, into one unifying party that can fight against all of these problems. And we think that, for example, our organization over the past summer led a demonstration against the Ku Klux Klan in Chicago, in which we were successful in preventing these racist terrorists from promoting their...
Make a question. There are a lot of people waiting here. Come on.
No, let me just say to the assemblage, we do have limited time.
I'll be just
So
brief for wrap it up.
Yeah, if you have a question, just state
Well,
it.
I don't really have a question. I just
Oh,
wanted to...
Okay, all right. Well, I think you've made you've given us a good analysis, and thanks. But
Okay.
yeah, I'd like
Well,
to ask
I would just
people-
like to encourage people to
Yeah.
check out our newspaper, The Workers' Vanguard. And
Yeah, okay,
this is the much-touted democracy of the universities that we've been hearing so much about. Thanks, guys.
yeah. All right.
Professor Chomsky, my question was, you mentioned earlier in your talk about public spending, you broke it down into 2 categories, that being social spending and military spending, one being democratic, the other being not. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the logic behind that, and also kind of delineate where the line can be drawn between military and spending. I mean, obviously you know what a school bus and a Boeing 727 is, but just explain the logic behind it.
Well, I don't really think that that's the right breakdown. What I tried to say is that in the late 40s, that was the choice. The choice was, when the business community was talking about how to ensure that public funds went to advanced sectors of industry, there were sort of two obvious channels. One is various means of social spending, which would stimulate the economy. They understood that. And the other was military spending, and they almost unanimously hit upon military spending. On the other hand, military spending is mostly, it's not really for military purposes. Like take, say, Boeing, which you mentioned. Boeing is the leading exporter, civilian exporter in the United States, called the leading civilian exporter. Aircraft is the leading civilian export. A big trade surplus from aircraft. Furthermore, one of the biggest service industry is tourism, which is of course aircraft based, which brings big surpluses back to the United States. Well, what is all this based on? Well, it's based on military production. That's where the electronics is developed, and the avionics, and the metals, and all the fancy stuff comes from military aircraft, military transports, or bombers or fighters, and then it's transferred over to commercial industry. This dual-use technology does give a step up to almost all production. And as I mentioned, the telecommunications industry, well, that was developed as military production. But of course, that means the internet and fiber optic transmission and so on and so forth. So you can't really break down military and civilian spending. They're integrated, and the military system has been used as a cover for ensuring that the public funding goes to advanced sectors of industry. That's been the way the U.S. economy has been working for a long time. I mean, maybe there's nothing more dramatic than computers, which are kind of core of a modern economy. In the 1950s, computers were not commercially marketable. So they were being developed at places like Lincoln Labs, under MIT lab out in Lincoln, within the framework guise, I think, but that's a value judgment, but at least within the framework of an air defense system. I don't think anybody seriously thought it was going to defend anybody from Russian airplanes, but it did develop the basic architecture and structure and software and so on for what became commercial computers, and one of the people high up in that project then went off and set up Dell, and then IBM got into the act, and so on and so forth. And that's about the way it goes. So it's not military spending serves a very definite function, I think essentially the function that Symington described. It disguises subsidy as by security. But I think that ought to be completely broken down, and these ought to be issues in the public arena which people ought to make decisions about. What the decisions ought to be, I don't think are so obvious. Like, how should the technology of the future be developed, and who should pay for it, and what should it be, and so on. Those are not so simple questions. But at least we ought to be able to agree on one thing. There are questions that ought to be made in the public, by the public, through direct participation, not in secret by the guys who are going to get to whom it's going to be given under the guise of security.
First of all, I'd like to thank both of you for doing the work that you have over the past 30, 40 years. That I think that for me, who really learned about it only 5 years ago, it's been an enlightening experience. But my question is, we've been talking a lot about social movements and social change. And there seems to be, in this period of time, another issue that's come up that has really changed the dynamic about how things might change. And that is the environmental movement, and a lot of people feel the crisis in the environment has really crossed a lot of class lines. I run a small hedge fund. A lot of people I deal with are very concerned about these issues and are willing to put considerable capital behind changing the system as it is, because they believe that things have to change fundamentally for us to reduce CO2 emissions and things like that. My question is, a lot of the vision for how things would change would be very similar to what Newt Gingrich did in '94. And that is that the way that Newt Gingrich attacked things was that he recruited and then trained and funded a whole group of representatives to try to change the nature of Congress and therefore the way that these policies would be dealt with. And there are a number of people who are in the environmental movement who are of the opinion that that is the way that things should be done. And if you were to commit a significant amount of money, and people are estimating that it would cost, if you could come up with, say, 300 million, an election cycle, that you could tip the scales enough to make things change. My question is, do you see an alternative vision? Since both of you have studied this kind of social change in some depth, I was wondering if each of you could comment on an alternative vision for that kind of change.
Remember Noam spoke about powers behind the scenes? Yeah. We take our orders from people back here who tell me that, you think this should be the last question? Is that what you're saying?
I have good news, 5 more questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Just say something quickly. I guess you're asking about the pouring of money into electoral campaigns.
Or other options.
Or other options.
Based upon
well,
what
there
you're
better be
saying.
other options.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because, if there's anything we've learned from social movements over a period of time, is that social change does not come about through the electoral process. It's helpful. It's not a bad idea to get, A in over B. Most of the time we have it's A or A prime. But if we have A over B, yeah, it's better. But where fundamental injustices have existed in this society, and the history of the labor movement shows this, history of the women's movement, the anti-war movement, gay movement, disabled people's movement, the initiatives have not come from Congress, the President, the Supreme Court. The initiatives have come from citizens' movement, people's movements. And then, whether you have a Republican or a Democrat up there, whether you have A or B up there, if you have a movement powerful enough, they will have to respond to that. So that's my sort of quick judgment on that.
I'm afraid we really do have to end, and let me just add last footnote. If we're thinking about buying elections, if that's the arena in which conflict is going to take place, we can make a pretty safe guess as to who's going to buy them.
If you made a direct plea openly that you're going to be a bidding war, obviously you're going to lose.
Yeah, that's right.
But
I don't think things either can be or ought to be done in secret. We try to do it. There are much more powerful forces that can do things in secret. We have to do things in public. What our strength is people, nothing else, I think.